back with Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. I'm gonna be cozy while I finish reading this book. We're at the tail end of it, so if you haven't gotten caught up, then I recommend that you do so. And start with part 1 and onward. It gets goofy. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say about that. So, where were we? Is your car operational? I think it might need a bit of work, Crowley admitted. I was thinking that we might take these good people into town, said Aziraphale. I owe Madame Tracy a meal, I'm sure, and her young man, of course. Shadwell looked over his shoulder, then up at Madame Tracy. Who's he talking about? No, how does he? What's he talking about? That's how it comes out. He asked her triumphant expression. Adam rejoined the them. I reckon we'll just be getting home, he said. But what actually happened? Said Pepper. I mean, there was all this, but it doesn't matter anymore, said Adam. But you could help so much, Anathema began. As they wandered back to their bikes, Newt took her gently by the arm. That's not a good idea, he said. Tomorrow's the first day of the rest of our lives. Do you know, she said, of all the trite sayings I've ever really hated, that comes top. Amazing, isn't it? Said Newt happily. Why, you've got Dick Turpin painted on the door of your car. It's a joke, really, said Newt. 'Cause everywhere I go, I hold up traffic, he mumbled wretchedly. Crowley looked glumly at the controls of the Jeep. Sorry about the car, Aziraphale was saying. I know how much she liked it. Perhaps if you concentrate really hard. Wouldn't be the same, said Crowley. Suppose not. Had it from new, you know. It wasn't a car. It was more of a sort of whole body glove, he sniffed. It's burning, he said. A breeze swept up the dust and dropped it again. The air became hot and heavy, imprisoning those within it like flies in syrup. He turned his head and looked into Aziraphale's horrified expression. But it's over, he said. It can't happen now. The thing, the correct moment or whatever, it's gone past. It's over. The ground began to shake. The noise was like a subway train, but not one passing under. It was more like the sound of one coming up. Crowley fumbled madly with the gear shift. That's not Beelzebub, he shouted above the noise of the wind. That's him, his father. This isn't Armageddon. This is personal. Start your bloody thing. The ground moved under Anathema and Newt, flinging them onto the dancing concrete. Yellow smoke gushed from between the cracks. Feels like a volcano, shouted Newt. What is it? Whatever it is, it's pretty angry, said Anathema. In the Jeep, Crowley was cursing. Aziraphale laid a hand on his shoulder. There are humans here, he said. Yes, said Crowley, and me. I mean, we shouldn't let this happen to them. Well, what? Crowley began and stopped. I mean, when you think about it, we've got them into enough trouble as it is, you and me, over the years. What with one thing and another. We were only doing our jobs, muttered Crowley. Yeah, so what? Lots of people in history have only done their jobs, and look at the trouble they caused. You don't mean we should actually try to stop him? What have you got to lose? Crowley started to argue, then realized he couldn't. There was nothing he could lose that he hadn't lost already. They couldn't do anything worse to him than he had coming to him already. He felt free at last. He also felt under the seat and found a tire iron. It wouldn't be any good, but then nothing would. In fact, it'd be much more terrible facing the adversary with anything like a decent weapon. That way, you might have a bit of hope, which would make it worse. Aziraphale picked up the sword, lately dropped by war, and hefted its weight thoughtfully. Gosh, it's been years since I used this, he muttered. About 6,000, said Crowley. My word, yes, said the angel. What a day that was, and no mistake. Good old days. Not really, said Crowley. The noise was growing. People knew the difference between right and wrong in those days, said Aziraphale dreamily. Well, yes, think about it. Yes, too much messing about. Yes. Aziraphale held up the sword. There was a whoomp as it suddenly flamed like a bar of magnesium. Once you've learned how to do it, you never forget, he said. He smiled at Crowley. I'd just like to say, he said, if we don't get out of this, that I'll have known deep down inside that there was a spark of goodness in you. That's right, said Crowley bitterly. Make my day. Where was it? Aziraphale held out his hand. Nice knowing you, he said. Crowley took it. Here's to the next time, he said. And Aziraphale, yes, just remember, I'll have known that deep down inside you were just enough of a bastard to be worth liking. And there was a scuffling noise, and they were pushed aside by the small but dynamic shape of Shadwell, waving the thunder gun purposefully. I would not trust you two southern Nancy boys to kill a lame rat in a barrel, he said. Who are we fighting now? The devil, said Aziraphale simply. Shadwell nodded, as if this hadn't come as a surprise, threw the gun down and took off his hat to expose a forehead known and feared wherever street-fighting men were gathered together. I reckon so, he said. In that case, I'm gonna use my head. Newt and Anathema watched the three of them walk unsteadily away from the jeep. With Shadwell in the middle, they looked like a stylized W. What on earth are they going to do? Said Newt. And what's happening? What's happening to them? The coats of Aziraphale and Crowley split along the seams. If you were to go, you might as well go in your own true shape. I was like, that word didn't want to come out. Feathers unfolded toward the sky. Contrary to popular beliefs, the wings of demons are the same as the wings of angels, although they're often better groomed. Shadwell shouldn't be going with them, said Newt, staggering to his feet. What's a Shadwell? He's this amazing old man. You'd never believe it. I've got to help him. Help him, said Anathema. I took an oath and everything, Newt said. Newt hesitated, sorry. Well, sort of an oath. And he gave me a month's wages in advance. Who are those other two, then? Friends of yours? Anathema began and stopped. Aziraphale had half turned, and the profile had finally clicked into place. I know where I've seen them before, she shouted, pulling herself upright against Newt as the ground bounced up and down. Come on, but something dreadful's going to happen if he's damaged the book. You're bloody well right. Newt fumbled in his lapel and found his official pin. He didn't know what they were going to go up against this time, but a pin was all he had. They ran. Adam looked around. He looked down. His face took on an expression of calculated innocence. There was a moment of conflict, but Adam was on his own ground, always and ultimately on his own ground. He moved one hand around in a blurred half circle. Aziraphale and Crowley felt the world change. There was no noise, there were no cracks. There was just that where there had been the beginnings of a volcano of satanic power, there was just clearing smoke and a car drawing slowly to a halt, its engine loud in the evening hush. It was an elderly car, but well preserved, not using Crowley's method though. Where dents were simply wished away. This car looked like it did. You knew instinctively because its owner had spent every weekend for 2 decades doing all the things the manual said should be done every weekend. Before every journey, he walked around it and checked the lights and counted the wheels. Serious-minded men who smoked pipes and wore mustaches had written serious instructions saying that this should be done, and so he did it. Because he was a serious-minded man who smoked a pipe and wore a mustache. Speaking of, I like smoking too. And did not take such injunctions lightly. Because if you did, where would you be? He had exactly the right amount of insurance. He drove 3 miles per hour below the speed limit, or 40 miles per hour, whichever was the lower. He wore a tie even on Saturdays. Archimedes said that with a long enough lever and a solid enough place to stand, he could move the world. He could have stood on Mr. Young. The car door opened and Mr. Young emerged. "What is going on here?" he said. "Adam! Adam!" But the them were streaking towards the gate. Mr. Young looked at the shocked assembly. At least Crowley and Aziraphale had had enough self-control left to winch in their wings. "What's he been getting up to now?" he sighed, not really expecting an answer. "Where's that boy got to? Adam, come back here this instant." Adam seldom did what his father wanted. Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenberger opened his eyes. The only thing strange about his surroundings was how familiar they were. There was his high school photograph on the wall and his little stars and stripes flag in the tooth mug next to his toothbrush, and even his little teddy bear still in its little uniform. The early afternoon sun flooded through his bedroom window. He could smell apple pie. That was one of the things he'd missed the most about spending his Saturday nights a long way from home. He walked downstairs. His mother was at the stove, taking a huge apple pie out of the oven to cool. "Hi, Tommy," she said. "I thought you was in England." Yes, Mom, I am normatively in England, Mom, protecting democratism, Mom, sir," said Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenberger. "That's nice, hun," said his mother. "Your papa's down in the big field with Chester and Ted, and they'll be pleased to see you." Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenberger nodded. He took off his military-issue helmet and his military-issue jacket, and he rolled up his military-issue shirt sleeves. For a moment, he looked more thoughtful than he had ever done in his life. Part of his thoughts were occupied with apple pie. "Mom, if any throughput eventuates promising to interface with Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenberger telephonically, Mom, sir, this individual will be..." "Sorry, Tommy?" Tom Deisenberger hung his gun on the wall above his father's battered old rifle. "I said, if anyone calls, Mom, I'll be down in the big field with Pop and Chester and Ted." The van drove slowly up to the gates of the airbase. It pulled over. The guards on the midnight shift looked in the window, checked the credentials of the driver, and waved him in. The van meandered across the concrete. It parked on the tarmac of the empty airstrip near where two men sat, sharing a bottle of wine. One of the men wore dark glasses. Surprisingly, no one else seemed to be paying them the slightest attention. "Are you saying," said Crowley, "that he planned it this way all along from the very beginning?" Aziraphale conscientiously wiped the top of the bottle and passed it back. "Could have," he said. "Could have. One could always ask him, I suppose." "From what I remember," replied Crowley thoughtfully, "and we were never actually on what you might call speaking terms, he wasn't exactly one for straight answer. In fact, he'd never answer at all. He'd just smile as if he knew something that you didn't." "And of course that's true," said the angel. "Otherwise, what'd be the point?" There was a pause, and both beings stared reflectively off into the distance as if they were remembering things that neither of them had thought of for a long time. The van driver got out of the van, carrying a cardboard box and a pair of tongs. Lying on the tarmac were a tarnished metal crown and a pair of scales. The man picked them up with tongs and placed them in the box. Then he approached the couple with the bottle. "Excuse me, gents," he said, "but there's meant to be a sword around here somewhere as well. At least that's what it says here at any rate, and I was wondering." Aziraphale seemed embarrassed. He looked around himself, vaguely puzzled, and then stood up to discover that he had been sitting on the sword for the last hour or so. He reached down and picked it up. "Sorry," he said, and put the sword into the box. The van driver, who wore an International Express cap, said not to mention it, and really it was a godsend, them both being there like this, since someone was going to have to sign to say that he'd duly collected what he'd been sent for, and this had certainly been a day to remember, eh? Aziraphale and Crowley both agreed with him that it had, and Aziraphale signed the clipboard that the van driver gave him, witnessing that a crown, a pair of balances, and a sword had been received in good order, and were to be delivered to a smudged address and charged to a blurred account number. The man began to walk back to his van. Then he stopped and turned. "If I was to tell my wife what happened to me today," he told them a little sadly, "she'd never believe me, and I wouldn't blame her, because I don't either." Then he climbed into his van and he drove away. Crowley stood up a little unsteadily. He reached a hand down to Aziraphale. "Come on," he said. "I'll drive us back to London." He took a jeep. No one stopped them. It had a cassette player. This is a general issue, even for American military vehicles, but Crowley automatically assumed that all vehicles he drove would have cassette players, and therefore this one did, within seconds of his getting in. The cassette that he put on as he drove was marked Handel's Water Music, and it stayed Handel's Water Music all the way home. Sunday, the first day of the rest of their lives. At around 10:30, the paperboy brought the Sunday papers to the front door of Jasmine Cottage. He had to make 3 trips. The series of thumps as they hit the mat woke up Newton Pulsifer. He left Anathema asleep. She was pretty shattered, poor thing. She'd been almost incoherent when he'd put her to bed. She'd run her life according to the prophecies, and now there were no more prophecies. She must be feeling like a train, which had reached the end of the line, but still had to keep going somehow. From now on, she'd be able to go through life with everything coming as a surprise, just like everyone else. What luck. The telephone rang. Newt dashed for the kitchen and picked up the receiver on the second ring. "Hello," he said. A voice of forced friendliness tinted with desperation gabbled at him. "No," he said. "I'm not, and it's not Debussy, it's Device, as in nice, and she's asleep." "Well," he said, "pretty sure she doesn't want any cavities insulated or double glazing. I mean, she doesn't own the cottage, you know. She's only renting it." "No, I'm not going to wake her up and ask her," he said. "And tell me, Miss Morrow, why don't you lot take Sundays off like everybody else does?" "Sunday," he said. "Of course it's not Saturday. Why would it be Saturday? Saturday was yesterday. It's honestly Sunday today, really. What do you mean you've lost a day? I haven't got it. Seems to me you've got a bit carried away with selling." "Hello?" he growled and replaced the receiver. "Telephone salespeople. Something dreadful ought to happen to them." He was assailed by a moment of sudden doubt. Today was Sunday, wasn't it? A glance at the Sunday papers reassured him. If the Sunday Times said it was Sunday, you could be sure that they'd investigated the matter. And yesterday was Saturday. Of course, yesterday was Saturday, and he'd never forget Saturday for as long as he lived. If he could only remember what it was he wasn't meant to forget. Seeing that he was in the kitchen, Newt decided to make breakfast. He moved around the kitchen as quietly as possible to avoid waking the rest of the household, and found every sound magnified. The antique fridge had a door that shut like the crack of doom. The kitchen tap dribbled like an incontinent gerbil and made a noise like Old Faithful, and he couldn't find where anything was. In the end, as every human being who has ever breakfasted on their own in someone else's kitchen has done since nearly the dawn of time, he made do with unsweetened instant black coffee. On the kitchen table was a roughly rectangular leather-bound cinder. He could just make out the words NIE and ACC on the charred cover. What a difference a day made, he thought. Turns you from the ultimate reference book to a mere barbecue briquette. Now then, how exactly had they got it? He recalled a man who smelled of smoke and wore sunglasses even in darkness, and there was other stuff all running together. Boys on bikes, an unpleasant buzzing, a small grubby face staring. It all hung around his mind, not exactly forgotten, but forever hanging on the cusp of recollection. Except for Giovanni Jacobo Casanova, 1725-1798, famed amorist and literateur, who revealed in volume 12 of his memoirs that, as a matter of course, he carried around with him at all times a small valise containing a loaf of bread, a pot of choice Seville marmalade, a knife, fork, a small spoon for stirring, 2 fresh eggs packed with care and unspun wool, a tomato or love apple, a small frying pan, a small saucepan, a spirit burner, a chafing dish, a tin box of salted butter of the Italian type, 2 bone china plates, also a portion of honeycomb as a sweetener for my breath and for my coffee. Let my readers understand me when I say to them all, a true gentleman should always be able to break his fast in the manner of a gentleman, wherever he may find himself. A memory of things that hadn't happened. How could you have that? He sat staring at the wall until a knock at the door brought him back to earth. There was a small, dapper man in a black raincoat standing on the doorstep. He was holding a cardboard box, and he gave Newt a bright smile. "Mr. He consulted a piece of paper in one hand. Pulsifer, said Newt. It's a hard S. I'm ever so sorry, said the man. I've only ever seen it written down, then it would appear that this is for you and Mrs. Pulsifer. Newt gave him a blank look. There's no Mrs. Pulsifer, he said coldly. The man removed his bowler hat. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, he said. There's my mother. And there was the matter of Dick Turpin. It looked like the same car, except that forever afterwards it seemed to be able to do 250 miles on the gallon of petrol. It ran so quietly that you practically had to put your mouth over the exhaust pipe to see if the engine was firing, and issued its voice-synthesized warnings in a series of exquisite and perfectly phrased haikus, each one original and apt. Late frost burns the bloom, would a fool not let the belt restrain the body, it would say, and the cherry blossom tumbles from the highest tree. One needs more petrol. Newt, she's not dead. She's just in Dorking. I'm not married. How odd. The letter is quite specific. Who are you? Said Newt. He was wearing only his trousers, and it was chilly on the doorstep. The man balanced the box awkwardly and fished out a card from an inner pocket. He handed it to Newt. Giles Batacombe. Roby, Red Fern, and by chance. Solicitors, 13 Demdike Chambers, Preston. Yes, he said politely. What can I do for you, Mr. Batacombe? You could let me in, said Mr. Batacombe. You're not serving a writ or anything, are you? Said Newt. The events of last night hung in his memory like a cloud, constantly changing whenever he thought he could make out a picture. But he was vaguely aware of damaging things that had been expecting retribution in some form. No, said Mr. Batacombe, looking slightly hurt. We have people for that sort of thing. He wandered past. Newt put the box down on the table. To be honest, he said, we're all very interested in this. Mr. By Chance nearly came down himself, but he doesn't travel well these days. Look, said Newt, I really haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. This, said Mr. Batacombe, proffering the box and beaming like a Xerophil about to attempt a conjuring trick, is yours. Someone wanted you to have it, and they were very specific. A present, said Newt. He eyed the taped cardboard cautiously, and then rummaged in the kitchen drawer for a sharp knife. I think more bequest, said Mr. Batacombe. You see, we've had it for 300 years. Sorry, was it something I said? Hold it under the tap. I should. What the hell is all this about? Said Newt, but a certain icy suspicion was creeping over him. He sucked at the cut. It's a funny story. Do you mind if I sit down? And of course, I don't know the full details because I joined the firm only 15 years ago, but it had been a very small legal firm when the box had been cautiously delivered. Redfern, by chance, and both the Robbies, let alone Mr. Batacombe, were a long way in the future. The struggling legal clerk who had accepted the delivery had been surprised to find tied to the top of the box with twine a letter addressed to himself. It contained certain instructions, 5 interesting facts about the history of the next 10 years, which, if put to good use by a keen young man, would ensure enough finance to pursue a very successful legal career. All he had to do was see that the box was carefully looked after for rather more than 300 years, and then delivered to a certain address. Although, of course, the firm had changed hands many times over the centuries, said Mr. Batacombe. But the box has always been part of the chattels, as it were. I didn't know they made Heinz baby foods in the 17th century, said Newt. That was just to keep it undamaged in the cause, said Mr. Battercombe. And no one's opened it in all these years, said Newt. Twice, I believe, said Mr. Battercombe. In 1757 by Mr. George Cranby, and in 1928 by Mr. Arthur Bychance, father of the present Mr. Bychance. He coughed. Apparently Mr. Cranby found a letter addressed to himself, said Newt. Mr. Battercombe sat back hurriedly. My word, how did you guess that? I think I recognize the style, said Newt grimly. What happened to them? Have you heard of this before? Said Mr. Battercombe suspiciously. Not in so many words. They weren't blown up, were they? Well, Mr. Cranby had a heart attack, it is believed, and Mr. Bychance went very pale and put his letter back in its envelope. I understand, and gave very strict instructions that the box wasn't to be opened again in this lifetime. He said anyone who opened the box would be sacked without references. A dire threat, said Newt sarcastically. It was, in 1928. Anyway, their letters are in the box. Newt pulled the cardboard aside. There was a small iron-bound chest inside. It had no lock. Go on, lift it out, said Mr. Battercombe excitedly. I must say, I'd very much like to know what's in there. We've had bets on it in the office. Tell you what, said Newt generously. I'll make us some coffee and you can open the box. Me? Would that be proper? I don't see why not. Newt eyed the saucepans hanging over the stove. One of them was big enough for what he had in mind. Go on, he said. Be a devil. I don't mind. You could have power of attorney or something. Mr. Battercombe took off his overcoat. Well, he said, rubbing his hands together, since you put it like that, it'd be something to tell my grandchildren. Newt picked up the saucepan, laid his hand gently on the door handle. I hope so. Here goes. Newt heard a faint creak. What can you see? He said. There's 2 open letters. Oh, and a third one addressed to... Newt heard the snap of a wax seal and a clink of something on the table. Then there was a gasp, the clatter of a chair, the sound of running feet in the hallway, a slam of a door, and the sound of a car engine being jerked into life and then redlined down the lane. Newt took the saucepan off his head and came out from behind the door. He picked up the letter and was not 100% surprised to see that it was addressed to Mr. G. Battercombe. He unfolded it. It read, Here's a florin, lawyer. Now run fast, lest ye world know the truth about you and Mistress Spitten, the typewriting machine slavey. Newt looked at the other letters. The crackling paper, the one addressed to George Cranby, said, Remove thy thieving hand, Mr. Cranby. I mind well how you swindled the widow Plashkin and Mitchelmoss past your skinny old snatch pastry. Newt wondered what a snatch pastry was. He would be prepared to bet that it didn't involve cookery. The one that had awaited the inquisitive Mr. Bychance said, You left them, you coward. Return this letter to the books, lest the world know the true events of June 7th, 1916. Under the letters was a manuscript. Newt stared at it. What's that? Said Anathema. He spun around. She was leaning against a door frame like an attractive yawn on legs. Newt backed against the table. Oh, nothing, wrong address. Nothing, just some old box. Junk mail, you know. On a Sunday, she said, pushing him aside. He shrugged as she put her hands around the yellowed manuscript and lifted it out. further nice and accurate prophecies of Agnes Nutter. She read slowly, concerning the world that is to come. The saga continued. Oh my. Let's see where we're at. I might stop here, because I might read a little longer. Okay, you guys stop the way into it. Okay. She laid it reverentially on the table and prepared to turn the first page. Its hand landed gently on hers. Think of it like this, he said quietly. Do you want to be a descendant for the rest of your life? She looked up, their eyes met. It was Sunday, the first day of the rest of the world, around 11:30. St. James Park was comparatively quiet. The Ducks, who were experts in realpolitik, as seen from the bread end, put it down to a decrease in world tension. There really had been a decrease in world tension, in fact, but a lot of people were in offices trying to figure out why, trying to find out where Atlantis had disappeared to, with 3 international fact-finding delegations on it, and trying to work out what had happened to all their computers yesterday. The park was deserted, except for a member of MI9 trying to recruit someone who, to their later mutual embarrassment, would turn out to be also a member of MI9, a tall man feeding the ducks. And there were also Crowley and Aziraphale. They strode side by side across the grass. Same here, said Aziraphale. The shop's all there, not so much as a soot mark. I mean, you can't just make an old Bentley, said Crowley. You can't get the patina. But there it is, large as life, right there in the street. You can't tell the difference. Well, I can tell the difference, said Aziraphale. I'm sure I didn't stock books with titles like Biggles Goes to Mars and Jack Cade, Frontier Hero, and 101 Things a Boy Can Do, and Blood Dogs of the Skull Sea. Gosh, I'm sorry, said Crowley, who knew how much the angel had treasured his book collection. Don't be, said Aziraphale happily. They're all mint first editions, and I looked them up in Skindle's price guide. I think the phrase you use is hooey. I thought he was putting the world back just as it was, said Crowley. Yes, said Aziraphale, more or less. As best you can, but he's got a sense of humor, too. Crowley gave him a sideways look. Your people been in touch, he said. No. Yours? No. I think they're pretending it didn't happen. Mine, too, I suppose. That's bureaucracy for you. And I think mine are waiting to see what happens next, said Aziraphale. Crowley nodded, a breathing space. He said, a chance to morally rearm, get the defenses up. Ready for the big one. They stood by the pond, watching the ducks scrabble for the bread. Sorry, said Aziraphale. I thought that was the big one. I'm not sure, said Crowley. Think about it. For my money, the really big one will be all of us against all of them. What, you mean heaven and hell against humanity? Crowley shrugged. Of course, if he did change everything, then maybe he changed himself too. Got rid of his powers, perhaps decided to stay human. Oh, I do hope so, said Aziraphale. Anyway, I'm sure the alternative wouldn't be allowed. Would it? I don't know. You can never be certain about what's really intended, plans within plans. Sorry, said Aziraphale. Well, said Crowley, who'd been thinking about this until his head ached. Haven't you ever wondered about it all? You know, your people, my people, heaven and hell, and good and evil, all that sort of thing. I mean, why? As I recall, said the angel stiffly, there was a rebellion and, yes. Why did it happen, eh? I mean, it didn't have to, did it? Said Crowley, a manic look in his eye. Anyone who could build a universe in 6 days isn't going to let a little thing like that happen unless they want it to, of course. Oh, come on, be sensible, said Aziraphale doubtfully. That's not good advice, said Crowley. That's not good advice at all. If you sit down and think about it sensibly, you come up with some very funny ideas, like why make people inquisitive, and then put some forbidden fruit where they can see it, with a big neon finger flashing on and off saying, "This is it." I don't remember any neon, metaphorically, I mean. Why do that if you really don't want them to eat it, eh? I mean, maybe you just want to see how it all turns out. Maybe it's all part of a great big ineffable plan, all of it. You, me, him, everything. Some great big test to see if what you built all works properly, eh? You start thinking it can't be a great cosmic game of chess. It has to be some just very complicated solitaire. And don't bother to answer. If we could understand it, we wouldn't be us, because it's all ineffable, said the figure feeding the ducks. Yeah, right, thanks. I watched the tall stranger carefully dispose of the empty bag in the litter bin and stalk away across the grass. Then Crowley shook his head. What was I saying? He said. Don't know, said Aziraphale. Nothing very important, I think. Crowley nodded gloomily. Let me tempt you to some lunch, he hissed. And they went to the Ritz again, where a table was mysteriously vacant, and perhaps the recent exertions had had some fallout in the nature of reality, because while they were eating for the first time ever, a nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. No one heard it over the noise of the traffic, but it was there right enough. Alright, here's where I'm going to stop, because there's still quite a bit to get through. And I want there to be more mystery before we finish it. I love this book. I'm not ready for it to end. Okay. But yes, I will be back at it, and sooner than the time frame that was between the last reading and today. So yes, we'll be on it. Namaste. Love you guys, and I'll see you on the next one.